We have seen that no text exists in isolation. There are always other texts around with which we can compare texts. It also exists in our own head, and we can compare what we are thinking with the text that we are thinking about. So we have talked about the text to self connections that we can make. We've talked about the text to text connections that we can make. But there's also a bigger world out there. We can also make text to the world connections. Now, what do we mean by that? What we mean is, for instance, that around us, for instance, we find media, we find advertisements, we find news material. We have a world of media out there. We have so much, we can't even start to explore all of it, but there's so much around us in terms of a world out there that we can explore. There are current news and events that we can compare this text to. In other words, when we hear this news event, we suddenly think, oh my word, this sounds just like 1917, when there was this virus scare. There's a world out there. A text doesn't exist in a little compartment. There's always a world to compare it to. We can think of historical events like I've just mentioned. We can think of events in other countries, right? Here's a text and it tells us about the current situation, about a certain aspect, say the COVID in South Africa. And then how does it compare to Italy? How does it compare to other worlds? And we think of the world out there. And as I said, even historical events, what happened then and what was the cause then, etc. And of course, we have other domains of knowledge. It's not only like novels, drama, and so poetry that we're reading, or articles, social media. There are other domains of knowledge. There's academic articles, other domains of knowledge that we can go out and explore and bring it into our understanding of a text. So when we do the text to the world connections, we're going to ask ourselves a few questions. We're going to reflect upon a few aspects. For instance, when we look at this text, how does it remind you of your world? This is a text that I'm reading. Say I'm reading the book Toti. How does that remind me of the world that I am living in right now? Is this world similar? Is it different? And how can the world out there affect, and the world that I'm living in, help me to understand the world of the text? And also the world at large. How can that help my understanding of the text? Always looking for similarities and differences to things that happen in the real world. We are looking at events in the story, things that happen in the story and how they differ, or how they're similar to things that happen in different parts of the world. So it's not only your own world, but also different parts of the world and the world at large that you're going to bring into this kind of equation. And you ask yourself how the text connects with current events, with historical events, for instance, and also how the text might have contemporary or future implications. And you can go and check that. For instance, how does the world created in 1984, the novel by George Orwell, how the world that he predicted is going to happen in the future, how did it pan out? How did it work? Did it actually happen the way he said? Are we speaking newspeak, for instance? How does it work? In our world, is it reflected in the way that was predicted, for instance, by George Orwell? All these things come into play. In fact, it is crucial that we know how to make text to the world connections, because if we don't do that, the prescribed works that we are going to study, some of them are not going to make sense to you at all if you don't know about the world out there. And you do need to go and read about it. So, in other words, once again, you're going to use another text. You're going to do text to text, and you're going to make it part of yourself. It's text to self, but it's the world out there and how the world is right now and what's happening now and how does it relate. So, for a thorough understanding, especially for a contemporary understanding, in other words, how do we understand, for instance, the book Tsotsi now in our world, we're going to have to know what it was like, for instance, in District 6. We need to know a bit about that. We need to know about apartheid. We're going to need to know about the passes that the people had to carry, the pass laws. We're going to need to know what it was like in townships then. How is it in townships now? We're going to have to look at other Athol Fugard texts. What is a general trend in Athol Fugard's dramas, for instance, in terms of the South African themes that he talked about? And how does it relate to the novel? And perhaps why did he write a different genre? You stop to think about it that he wrote only one novel. One wonders why. And are the themes similar? And so on. We can only know if we make text to the world, text to text, and to self connections. So we also need to know about the contemporary situation now. And that's going to just broaden our whole perspective of what's happening in Tsotsi, for instance. Furthermore, you're going to have a very limited understanding of the Great Gatsby. You're probably going to just read it as a little love story or something, or a tragic story, tragic love story, if you like. You're not going to get half of the meaning if you don't bring the world in. If you don't know about the Jazz Age, for instance, in which Scott Fitzgerald lived and that he portrayed in The Great Gatsby, you won't understand why they had those wild parties. It was just after the war and people went crazy. They just wanted to have a party from morning till midnight and every day, every week, not knowing, of course, how the world would crash, or their big dream of wealth would crash with the stock exchange crash in the 30s and the Great Depression that would follow. But you need to know about the Jazz Age. Otherwise, you're not going to understand half of it. And the newly rich, for instance, of the time. Otherwise, you won't understand Gatsby and how he got his money. You must know about prohibition and about bootlegging, right? And if you read about moonshining today happening still in America, it comes from there. They're going to the mountains at the river and they make their very, very, very strong alcohol drinks in there, and it's still happening. But how does it relate to prohibition in those times? And is America still dry, or some of the states still dry, or what? Look at the world and see what's happening there, and how it's just stayed the same or differ, or where it differs from then. If you don't know anything about the American dream, you're going to miss the one major theme of what's happening in the Great Gatsby, and how the life story of Scott Fitzgerald reflects, for instance, the relationship of Daisy and Gatsby, and his wife Zelda, and the way in which she wouldn't at first marry him until he made money, and then of course he made the money after having sold his first book, and then she would marry him, etc. There are so many things. There's a world out there. There are texts to consult. There's a world out there to consult. Historical events, current events, all these things just make us understand this much better. And also, if you stop to think about it, the way in which, say, for instance, they made the current or the latest Great Gatsby movie, and how it differs from the previous one with Robert Redford, and this is Leonardo DiCaprio as Gatsby, and how it differs, and how perhaps the techniques have evolved, and so it's text to text comparisons, but also the world and the world that we live in, and how that allows for new technology, etc., and how that could actually improve perhaps the quality of films even. So here also, if we look at Animal Farm, of course, there's a lot of text to the world connections. Current events, what is happening, for instance, in South Africa at the moment, what's happening in other places at the moment where power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. There's been a recent rendition of Animal Farm, the drama, where a few years back, when the setting, everything was changed and geared towards South Africa, and changed to become tongue in cheek for what's happening in the South African situation. What are we doing? We're bringing in the current world, we are superimposing it onto the world of the text. We are showing how the world interacts with a text as well. In the same way as when the novel was written, and the Stalin and his doing, and the revolution, and all those things that happened in the world, the historical things, how that affected the text. All those things are relevant when we talk about text to the world connections. So when we ask ourselves, why then? Why do we do these connections? The world, other texts, and our own heads, text to self. Why do we do that? It should actually be very obvious to you that it can just deepen our understanding and appreciation of a text, that it could show us how multifaceted a text can be, and how interrelated texts can be, and in the process how we can get involved, because our world is involved and our heads are involved, and we can think and we can reflect, and how it becomes an alive thing happening in our heads, this interaction with the world and texts. It promotes critical thinking, because we can ask ourselves, is this better or is this bad? Do I like that? No. This is a terrible rendition. I don't think this is applicable at all in terms of this novel. So I don't like it. So your critical thinking, it can help you to identify themes across texts, etc. And the characteristics, for instance, or the writing style of a person, if you compare, say, Fugard's dramas with his novel writing style, it can highlight similarities for you, or differences between genres, themes, messages, styles. It can activate relevant background knowledge. You have to select what is applicable for your thorough understanding of this text, for instance. And of course, it can illuminate the interconnectedness of all knowledge. Because not only knowledge of certain literature works of literature, but other works, academic works, other texts, and other aspects of our lives, how we can bring it all together to just illuminate our understanding of the written and the visual text that we have in front of us and that we wish to understand.